I'm Sue Roffey. I'm an adjunct professor at Exeter University College and Western Sydney Universities.
My name's Dr. Kulvarn. I'm currently head teacher of two large primary schools in the East London borough of Redbridge.
Everyone, my name's Chris Bagley. I'm an educational psychologist.
We've talked a great deal about the things that are happening in schools at the moment that are not working effectively for a large cohort of our young people, and we can understand that there are issues around, teachers feeling that they've got to, focus on getting through the curriculum, and that some of these children disrupt that effort. But unless we're going to fail a lot more future students, particularly now after the pandemic, because we've seen that there's going to be a lot of young people who've not had a good lockdown for all sorts of reasons, living in toxic environments, being shut down, not being able to learn, not being able to have access to the support that they're used to. So what we'd like to do now is sort of think about what would we like to see with education in the future, and how do we actually make well-being and the ability for every child to flourish in their own way a core feature of every school. Chris, do you want to set us off on that track?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll just keep it within that frame of behaviour as well, within behaviour management of schools. I think we've touched on this already, but for me as a psychologist working with the young people who are at risk of exclusion, have been excluded, or sometimes are in the youth justice system, what I notice is they are, I think Kulvarn described, placed in a box at school, as is every young person. And there's a very specific type of human being that is valued in mainstream education. And that is an academic conformist, is the way I describe it. You have to be able to sit still, listen, learn, write essays, and not rock the boat. And as we touched on a lot, actually, in the first half, some young people simply aren't able to do that. And Gabor Mate, who's my favourite psychiatrist, he talks about choice not being absolute. Young people don't kick off in lessons necessarily because they're consciously trying to gain attention from other young people. They don't kick off in lessons often because they are just wanting to be naughty to raise their street cred. And you get these systemic myths that develop about young people in schools. And some schools manage that exceptionally well, and they come together and they work really collaboratively to understand what the young person's needs are, and then to help them to express themselves in a more positive way. But I think the most underlying issue that I notice is the inflexibility of the curriculum, which means young people who aren't able to sit still, they aren't able to self-regulate very easily. Maybe they have adverse childhood experiences, as Sue pointed out earlier. If you don't provide other ways for that young person to express themselves and other ways for them to succeed that's outside the auspices of sit down, learn academically, it's almost impossible for that young person to manage their emotions. Now, if you think about a young person who is really poor academically and is very dysregulated emotionally and struggles to build relationships, they might experience 5 sessions of failure a day at school in the secondary school context. It's impossible to expect that young person to be able to just sit calmly and put up with that every day of the week. It's just not feasible. So for me, just to start this conversation off, one of the things that I think is absolutely crucial and that does happen in certain other countries that we'll be aware of is there needs to be more flexibility around what the curriculum is, significantly more flexibility around what competence means for young people, and they need to have more autonomy in deciding what success means for them. Otherwise, they're going to continue to be blamed for behaviours that are caused by numerous other factors that are often beyond their control.
I do think that personalised curriculums happen in a number of independent schools. I've seen that happen. And I think that if you have a system of personal bests so that youngsters are actually evaluating themselves against their previous performance, then they are not constantly in the competition where they're going to be losers. And exactly what you're saying, Chris. I think it's quite hard for teachers and schools at the moment because we are in a straitjacket of a curriculum. And one of the things that's probably been highlighted by the pandemic is the ability for kids, once they're given the opportunity, to be amazingly creative. And we actually need a much broader range of subjects. You were talking, Kulvarn, about the SEAL programme. Well, that's fallen into, into the wayside. The whole pillars of education that we talked about last time, learning to know and learning to do, which is the only thing that's actually happens in schools at the moment, and learning to be and learning to live together and learning to be responsible for changing, positive change in our communities, just has gone to the wall. So by and large, I would say that we have to be thinking, rethinking, rebooting about what children learn, what education is for, how children learn, and there's a raft of different ways that different kids learn, and the environment in which they are learning. And I think that those things are big asks, but unless we start talking about it now, then we're going to continue to have a large number of children who are really not going to achieve in any sense of the word. And we know, as you've said, places like Glasgow, for instance, who focus on a nurturing curriculum for everybody, has dropped school exclusions to nothing, and have also been part of a move to reduce by 50% youth crime. I mean, the whole of the community has been impacted positively by Glasgow being a nurturing city. And of course, there's lots of other examples across the world. It requires political will, and it requires a different belief about kids themselves. My TED talk was about school as family. We need an education system that mirrors healthy child development, and at the moment we don't have it.
Can I just throw in one sentence there before you come in, Kulvarn, and that is, there's an amazing document written by the House of Commons, and Will Linden, who runs the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland, suggested that across the nation there has been a paradigm shift that's noticeable everywhere, that's growing in prominence. And he was really clear that you can exert this change that you just described to nationally. It's possible to do it, I think, is the message I wanted to chip in. Sorry, Kulvarn, I'm aware that you've got...
I'm just enjoying listening to you both, because I absolutely agree with you. Interestingly, I would describe myself as the absolute opposite of an academic conformist. I'd find it very, very difficult to learn in the way in which is often prescribed for our children. So that probably makes me a little bit biased, but just drawing back on those emotional factors, that if we and also about this need for a whole school approach.
Yes.
When we talk about consistency in schools, it's not consistency of sanctions, it's consistency of values, consistency of approach, consistency of caring, consistency of a curriculum that has at its core a focus on building children's personal, social, emotional skills. And an example of that is that part of my earlier research was that the biggest single factor that impacts upon a child's engagement in learning is about their self-esteem and self-perception of themselves as a learner. The difference between their perceived self and their ideal self. And their ideal self is the child in that classroom that is getting it right straight away, is praised by the teacher for the behaviour, and this impacts upon how they see themselves. And if we are not enabling our children to bridge that gap between how they perceive themselves, so rather than comparing child against child, comparing themselves against themselves, what Sue talked about, personal best, we are, one of the highest performing. We have been one of the highest performing primary schools in London over many years. So when people say, oh, we've got to focus on getting the outcome, we are getting the outcomes because we build strong relationships, and we look at every child in terms of our responsibility as a whole school community, including children, and every adult and teacher is trained in terms of structured conversations, emotion coaching, understanding how their emotions, and often with behaviourist policies, it's because it's in the best interest of the adults rather than in what is in the best interest of the child. And we all know that there are children they are teaching will frustrate us, okay? But it's our responsibility as lead learner to enable that child to feel safe. And our example, and that has to be led from the top. If you've got leaders going into positions whose only experience is behaviourist policies, they aren't going to be able to look at this approach. And maybe we do need to look at Glasgow and see what they've done at a systemic level. And what I often say to teachers, it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be disappointed. It's just a question of what you do about that. And one of the things I say is some of the most difficult children to love that you teach are the ones that need the most love.
I would absolutely agree.
Around the shoulder. They don't need the isolation because that is the rejection. And what are they going to come back to? They're going to come back to the same environment from which they were excluded. What will have changed? Yeah. Unless you're just beating them into conformity, are we improving behaviour? Are we improving their learning? Are we enabling them to reflect? And so we do a rights-based approach. Every child has a right to an education, and they have the responsibility to respect that right.
Can I also just talk a little bit now about the language that we use around kids and in schools, because I think that a lot of kids and generally, there is a dominance of deficit-based language. And you were talking, Kulvarn, about the importance of how kids see themselves. If we talk to kids and about kids as being disordered or lazy or rude or what have you, and that's the conversations that is around them, surrounds them, that's how they develop their self-concept. They will take that on board and then they will live it out. If the conversation around is actually looking at their strengths, looking about, and I just don't mean strengths in maths or even art, but strengths in who they are, you know, that they have a capacity to be kind, to be considerate, to be thoughtful, to be funny, then they start to think about themselves differently. At the moment, if we only use deficit language, they have nothing to live up to except that. If we give them a strengths-based framework, and that involves teachers understanding the power of words, and I don't think people do. Often I listen to interviews about people who've not had a good time at school, but have been successful in the world in some ways. And they say that it's just a teacher that actually helped them see themselves differently or see their potential differently. And sometimes it's just one or two conversations, you know, and those conversations can change lives and save lives. And we don't value or acknowledge that enough. Chris?
Yes. You're just, sorry, just very quickly, you're also talking about the hidden curriculum, the hidden messages that I'm given, and the hidden cues that I pick up on. Does this adult really like me? Does this adult really value me? And what I often say to teachers, I say this all the time, is that usually those 30 children or 20 children, they want you to like them more than you want them to like you. It's for teachers to maintain and build that trust and to lose it. So a teacher's responsibility is to motivate, is to inspire, is to connect. And that is not going to be done through a one-size-fits-all. We would personalise in terms of learning activities, outcome. We need to personalise. And I think that we're doing our children a disservice because children tend to be much more understanding of the behaviours of others than many of the adults. Sorry, Chris.
No, good points. Very good points. I think it's really strikes me how our conversation seems to be based really significantly around identity, the young person's identity, and the fact that the way we behave is influenced to an enormous extent by who we think we are and who other people think we are. And I just wanted to share some of the insights that the young people are sharing with us with states of mind. We're doing podcasts with numerous young people at the moment. Most of them are high attainers, which makes it even more interesting what they're saying. And this issue of identity is coming across so incredibly powerfully from the young people. And what they're saying is, basically reflecting this conversation quite significantly, they're saying that what school does is it pigeonholes them into this student bracket, and they're leaving school at 18, and so many young people are not really sure who they are. They're not having a stable sense of identity. They don't have a strong sense of self. And when I asked them about the impact of that on young people who are less high attaining, they were extremely intelligent, very switched on, and able to indicate exactly the reasons why their behaviour tends to go off the rails and what that's communicating. And one of the young people said that just communicates alienation. And I think that's what a lot of the behaviour policies in schools do to young people. They alienate them from adults, they alienate them from the system itself. And often schools, because the values underpinning it are very much market-based, competition-based and academic outcomes-based, they can't be flexible to allow teachers often to build those relationships that you're both describing there. So teachers are in a catch-22 situation themselves. And if you look at the research and the qualitative data coming from teachers, what they're saying is that the performativity agenda, the outcomes-based agenda, is meaning that they can't build relationships with young people. And we know from research that teacher-student relationships are absolutely critical to a young person's identity. And if the young person thinks the teachers like them, they will perform better. They will behave, even in lessons they don't like. That's absolutely crystal clear, and that's been done since the 1970s. So just to finish this point, I think young people need to perceive themselves as having an identity that means they're worthy, valued, intelligent. And if you only define intelligence one way, and if you only allow teachers to build relationships around outcomes and often diagnostic language, as you put it, Sue, so negative language around basically failure, non-achievement, if everything's framed around that, you're going to continue to be having what the government would describe as behaviour problems, when I would describe it as value problems.
Yeah, I just want to say, building on the things that you've both said, is that you've said, Kulvarn, that in secondary schools there's teachers saying that they're just sick of this relationship thing, right? And the focus on relationships. Can I just say that relationships and emotions exist everywhere, all the time, right? And if somebody says, I don't have a relationship with that person, most of the time they're saying, we have a bad relationship. And it's not just about what's happening at school that's an issue here. It's what's happening in our wider society. If we want to have a society where people are actually compassionate, they care, they know about how you establish a positive relationship, they can tune into their own emotional literacy, then you actually absolutely have to do something different from what we're currently doing, because we're setting up some real problems for the future if we don't. And I know that that's a possibility. We need to be shouting loud and clear about what's really important in education and what it's for.
I absolutely believe, whether or not you want to go down this marketisation, performativity agenda, is if you want the outcomes, you need to decide as a school what you want your legacy to be. What do we believe in? What is most important to us? And I always say that I don't actually care if someone's doing really well in English, maths and science, and I'll say this openly to all the staff, if they are not a good person. Because actually, what have we achieved fundamentally? And if that is your starting point as a professional community, and you've talked, Sue, about this concept of family, we say that all the time. We say to our children, you have two families. You have your family at home and you have your family at school. And the reason we say that is because your responsibilities change, your values change. You know that you have a responsibility to those around you in your family to support them in their learning. And I think if we are going to, we certainly believe in a dialogic approach to teaching, which is focused on oracy and children's ability to engage in critical thinking and debate. And I think it would be very sad if we're developing these articulate critical thinkers at 11 who are then going into a secondary school where they become academic conformists. And my final point there is every first week in September, I am guaranteed that a child who has never, ever misbehaved in any form or hasn't for many years and is engaged and loves learning will come back and tell me they had a detention in their first week. And I'll say, why? I went to the wrong classroom and then I was late for the next classroom, or I forgot to bring my homework book back in on a Thursday. And if I can only look at that and say that, let's hit them hard, these year sevens in the first couple of weeks, and then they'll know what they have to do. But what were you doing? At what expense? You might lose their voice. And so, I mean, we could probably talk about this all day, couldn't we? But yeah, I think.
One of the things that the research says, and everything that I do is evidence-based, is that spending 8 hours at the beginning of a school year developing relationships, getting to know young people and what drives them, what motivates them, what they're interested in, will save you multiples of that time picking up pieces later on in the school year.